dead.
You get what you fucking deserve!
Smile, though your heart is aching. Smile, even though it's breaking. When there are clouds in the sky.
With the wake of FOSTA and SESTA last year, sex work is increasingly becoming a divisive issue on the left, with much of the mainstream socialist left abandoning what used to be a widely accepted opposition to prostitution within the old left, for a more liberalized brand of libertarian socialism which tries to sell the hedonism of 21st century neoliberal capitalism off as revolutionary. While this video is directed at dispelling the foolishness of the pro-sex work left, I also aim to tackle a wider issue, which is the hedonist left. In mainstream socialism, from the DSA to modern libertarian socialists, there has been a corruption of vision, where ideological forerunners such as Babeuf and Blanqui held Robespierre's vision of a virtuous republic, where Marx and Engels so vigorously opposed the lumpen, and where the Soviet Union upheld the concept of the new Soviet man and woman. The new left seems to have no vision of new societal myths, and higher virtues to replace those of the old order. It seems today that the mainstream socialist left has no greater vision for a socialist society than what would essentially be Night City but with co-ops. Although to be balanced, some of their opposition on small corners of the internet are really nothing but red conservatives, who have no better ideas than to preserve old social norms in the face of a corrupt and hedonistic new left. Within the dying vestiges of BreadTube, the flag of sex work is raised high. It is claimed by these red liberals that prostitution is an emancipatory force for women from patriarchal structures such as monogamy, that the sex industry will become safer and less exploitative if decriminalized or legalized, and that sex work does constitute real productive labor in the Marxian and wider classical economic view. But that is simply my observation, so let us take it from the words of soy in human form themselves.
I've always been highly supportive of the sex industry as both a leftist and as a liberal. Many people do enter the sex industry because of the autonomy and freedom that it gives them. Many people also enter the sex industry because they really like sex. I'm not disputing this, I've got friends who do it.
So sometimes things are partially criminalized and partially not, and it can be a little murky. So if only I could conjure some kind of expert. Well, I guess let's get started. For those who aren't familiar, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do?
Hi, I'm Riley Reyes. I'm an adult performer, and I'm also the chair of APAC, the Adult Performer Advocacy Committee, which is a labor group by and for adult film performers.
But the overwhelming reason why people enter the industry is money. Now, before we go on, if you're wondering, I am not one of those people who considers any sex that has money involved with it unconsensual. Any profession under capitalism will involve a lack of consent to some degree. It doesn't make woodwork intolerable.
Largely, I see discussions about sex work, at least in the public eye, being led by white feminist celebrities who are interested in stopping sex trafficking. There's very little public discourse about sex work as labor rights at all. Lately, that's been changing. I've been so excited to see the word swerf entering popular usage in leftist spaces. Swerf is a sex work excluding radical feminist. That is a very, very recent term. And it has only been in the past few years that I have seen non-sex workers proudly stand up for sex work as valid labor.
As you can see, the narrative on sex work is exactly like how I described, and can be broken down into the following points that I will address. That sex work constitutes valid work, in the sense that it qualifies as real productive labor in the classical economic view. That sex workers are members of the proletariat through their marginalized status. That the freedom of sex workers is a necessary part of leftist ideology. That prostitution and other sex work is a progressive institution. That the Nordic model causes more problems than legalization. That opposition to sex work is conservative moralism. For an understanding of productive labor, we can look to Paul Cockshot's article on unproductive labor as understood by Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. I will spare the bulk of the article and read to you only the 2 qualifications for productive labor which Paul Cockshot takes from classical economics. But I recommend you read the entire article, as it gives insight into modern capitalism's feudal degeneration, a point that will be brought up in this topic, and one that has been mentioned in my past anti-imperialist videos. The qualifications for productive labor are as follows. The labor must be employed out of capital, not revenue, and the labor must result in a persistent, vendible product, something that lasts beyond the moment in which the labor is produced. Now clearly, sex work does not fit this definition, as there is no production of a tangible commodity, and the industry simply collects revenue from the buyer. There is no profit extraction in the production process, as there is no actual production that occurs. And obviously, sex doesn't last past the act itself, so no persistent product is produced, except for maybe STDs. At face value, you may think that porn would qualify for productive labor, as there is a tangible commodity in the form of a media file that can be viewed. However, the only difference from porn and prostitution is that the act of prostitution is recorded so that revenue could be made from individual distribution or through collecting ad money. So in reality, porn hardly qualifies as a persistent vendible product, but the entire industry is based on collecting revenue rather than on extracting profits through the production process. Therefore, the production of porn does not constitute real productive labor. For a better grasp on a socialist view towards sex work, we can look towards classic socialist thinkers. We will start with Alexandra Kollontaj's famous essay, Prostitution and Ways of Fighting It. And for context, Alexandra Kollontaj was a well-known Marxist feminist, the creator of International Working Women's Day, and a free love advocate, which during that time meant abolishing feudal forms of marriage for free and mutual relationships and not hyper non-monogamous hookup culture. What is the fundamental quality of the working class? What is its strongest moral weapon in the struggle? Solidarity and comradeship is the basis of communism. Unless this sense is strongly developed amongst working people, the building of a truly communist society is inconceivable. Politically conscious communists should therefore, logically, be encouraging the development of solidarity in every way, and fighting against all that hinders its development. Prostitution destroys the equality, solidarity, and comradeship of the two halves of the working class. A man who buys the favors of a woman does not see her as a comrade or as a person with equal rights. He sees the woman as dependent upon himself and as an unequal creature of a lower order who is of less worth to the worker's state. The contempt he has for the prostitute, whose favors he has bought, affects his attitude to all women. The further development of prostitution, instead of allowing for the growth of comradely feeling and solidarity, strengthens the inequality of relationships between the sexes. For her vision of what constitutes a healthy sexual culture under socialism, she writes the following. I will not take it upon myself to prophesy the form that marriage or relationships between the sexes will assume in the future. But of one thing there is no doubt. Under communism, all dependence of women upon men, and all the elements of material calculation found in modern marriage will be absent. Sexual relationships will be based on a healthy instinct for reproduction, prompted by the abandon of young love, or by fervent passion, or by a blaze of physical attraction, or by a soft light of intellectual and emotional harmony. Such sexual relationships have nothing in common with prostitution. Prostitution is terrible because it is an act of violence by the woman upon herself in the name of material gain. Prostitution is one naked act of material calculation, which leaves no room for considerations of love and passion. Where passion and attraction begin, prostitution ends. Under communism, prostitution and the contemporary family will disappear. Healthy, joyful, and free relationships between the sexes will develop. A new generation will come into being, independent and courageous, and with a strong sense of the collective. A generation which places the good of the collective above all else. This same basic view on prostitution was espoused far more astutely by Karl Marx in the Manifesto of the Communist Party. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians, and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. He continues, "But you communists would introduce a community of women," screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. The bourgeoisie sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeoisie at the community of women which, they pretend, is to be openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorial. Our bourgeois, not content with having wives and daughters of the proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Bourgeois marriage is, in reality, a system of wives in common, and thus, at the most, what the communist might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce, in substitution for a hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, i.e. of prostitution, both public and private. Moving on to Friedrich Engels in Chapter 2 of On the Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. By heterism, Morgan understands the practice, coexistent with monogamous marriage, of sexual intercourse between men and unmarried women outside marriage, which, as we know, flourishes in the most varied forms throughout the whole period of civilization, and develops more and more into open prostitution. This heterism derives quite directly from group marriage, from the ceremonial surrender by which women purchased the right of chastity. Surrender for money was at first a religious act. It took place in the temple of the goddess of love, and the money originally went to the temple treasury. The temple slaves of Anytus in Armenia and of Aphrodite in Corinth, like the sacred dancing girls attached to the temples of India, the so-called baiaderes. The word is a corruption of the Portuguese word baladeira, meaning female dancer, were the first prostitutes. Originally the duty of every woman. This surrender was later performed by these priestesses alone as representatives of all other women. Among other peoples, heterism derives from the sexual freedom allowed to girls before marriage. Again, therefore, a relic of group marriage, but handed down in a different way, with the rise of the inequality of property, already at the upper stage of barbarism. Therefore, wage labor appears sporadically side by side with slave labor, and at the same time, as its necessary correlate, the professional prostitution of free women side by side with the forced surrender of the slave. Thus, the heritage with group marriage has bequeathed to civilization is double-edged, just as everything civilization brings forth is double-edged, double-tongued, divided against itself, contradictory. Here monogamy, there heterism. With its most extreme form, prostitution. For heterism is as much a social institution as any other. It continues the old sexual freedom, to the advantage of the men. Actually not merely tolerated, but gaily practiced, by the ruling classes particularly. It is condemned in words, but in reality, this condemnation never falls on the men concerned, but only on the women. They are despised and outcast, in order that the unconditional supremacy of men over the female sex may be once more proclaimed as a fundamental law of society. And now lastly, we will move on to Vladimir Lenin. It is these women that the capitalists most willingly employ as home workers, who are prepared for a monstrously low wage to earn a little extra for themselves and their family, for the sake of a crust of bread. It is from among these women, too, that the capitalists of all countries recruit for themselves, like the ancient slave owners and the medieval feudal lords, any number of concubines at a most reasonable price, and no amount of moral indignation, hypocritical in 99 cases out of 100, about prostitution can do anything against this trade in female flesh, so long as wage slavery exists. Inevitably, prostitution too will exist. All the oppressed and exploited classes throughout the history of human societies have always been forced, and it is in this that their exploitation consists, to give up to their oppressors, first their unpaid labor, and second, their women as concubines for the masters. The view of prostitution as viewed by socialists should be clear. Prostitution is a reactionary and feudal institution premised on the rent of flesh and empowered by bourgeois sexual gluttony. This reactionary vestige is shifted into overdrive through capitalism, the commodification of human sexuality and its open sale on the market. It is capitalist estrangement of sex into commodity fetishism, estranged from real human essence, which constitutes a sexuality fueled by love and passion, not greed and hedonism. By any feminist standpoint, prostitution lowers the position of a woman into that of a slave, whose flesh is to be bought and sold on the market. The social ill that is prostitution transfers its effects into the rest of society as it reproduces the bourgeois social logic. Endless gluttony and hedonism, sexual assault, violence towards women, hookup culture, growing distrust between men and women, all results of prostitution, and by extension, although indistinguishable, porn. Secondly, these quotes do well to highlight bourgeois degeneracy and decadence. It is well said that the degenerate and social parasitic bourgeoisie enjoy a hedonistic community of women to fulfill all of their passionless, self-serving desires. This class, in much the same way previous ruling classes took women from lower classes as concubines, promotes the greatest sexual decadence and degeneracy that has never, in any point in human history, been seen. It is therefore well said by Marx that communists seek to end this bourgeois coomerism. After all, if you had any amount of testosterone in you, leftist men, unlike our cretins, would settle for nothing less than killing a bourgeois man who dare lust after a proletarian woman, not traffic our women to this class, as is the doings of the lumpen. And, as said by Lenin, that prostitution will inevitably exist under capitalism, I have no delusions that we can rely on the bourgeois state to abolish prostitution. And this is a point we must illustrate to other abolitionists. What we can do in the present time, however, as communists, is form our own squads, build a presence on the streets, and take the fight to the lumpen ourselves. There must also be a clarification on the class position of sex workers. Those prostitutes who are victims of human trafficking and who are under the oppression of a pimp or a capitalist are exploited slaves who require emancipation. However, a new development in the sex work industry has come into fruition with the rise of the internet. This development is that of the freelance independent sex worker, who collects revenue for performing sexual acts. The class position of these women is far from proletarian. They are lumpen, petite bourgeois-minded entrepreneurs. any socialist who takes up the cause of freelance sex workers because in their eyes they are marginalized are nothing short of liberals. The cause of socialism is the class victory of the proletariat to win a workers' republic, to build towards a society built on the common ownership of means of production and land, and where human labor is in tandem with self-actualization. These independent, freelance sex workers are not proletarians, and therefore do not deserve our concern for their petite bourgeois view of rights. You may say that sex workers do their job for entirely voluntary reasons, and because they are doing it independently. To put it in their words, that human movement shouldn't be infringed upon. This is the sort of talking point you would expect to hear from a laissez-faire libertarian, not a self-proclaimed socialist. These socialists who spew rhetoric like this only use socialism as an accessory. The primary mode of analysis is liberal moralism. Class analysis is secondary, only when it is useful. There is another claim that sex work is a progressive institution because it somehow liberates women from monogamy. This could not be further from the truth. Sex work is best defined as the rent of flesh. Its profits are from revenue and not production. Clearly, by this categorization, sex work is a reactionary, feudal institution. The shift of sex work into hyperdrive with the dawn of the information age is no coincidence. In this late stage of capitalism, it is taking an increasingly degenerated form, in that it is becoming far more feudal in its composition as it shifts from exploitation based in production profits to exploitation in the form of rent. There is a final argument for the leftist quality of sex work, which was argued by a porn star interviewed by PhilosophyTube, a channel which is nothing but an abortion of philosophy. I'll play the clip so you hear her words for yourselves, as this level of liberal foolishness cannot be put into words.
So I guess this kind of leads us quite nearly onto decriminalization. Like, what is it to you? What is it to the people that you work for and with? And I see a lot of people conflating it with legalization as well.
Decriminalization would allow sex workers to operate without fear of arrest, but relatively independently and without a lot of infrastructure. Whereas legalization would probably require a lot of licensing, maybe specific venues, and tends to lead to sort of a brothel system. All of the sex worker organizations I talk to is the full decriminalization of full service sex work. And that's not just of selling sex itself. It's of buying sex. It's of helping people who are selling sex. It's of creating homes where you can work cooperatively and sell sex. Decriminalization puts the power in the hands of the workers and in the hands of labor. And legalization, in many cases, requires you to have some wealthy capitalist who can pay for all of your licenses and the legalized brothel who is going to take a large percentage of your money and control the way in which you move through the world.
So, the belief is that decriminalization of an industry under capitalism means its workers have control over that industry. So it is the state's recognition, and not the workings of capital, that decide capitalist exploitation. This truly is an infantile liberal disorder. If the sex work industry were to be decriminalized, it would be dominated by lumpen criminal class enemies into petite bourgeois slum firms. Besides, you freelance, independent sex workers are not the brothers and sisters of the proletariat. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, rights, freedoms, and democracy exist only for proletarians. You as freelance sex workers do not get rights, you do not get freedom, and you do not get democracy. Your class, along with the bourgeoisie, will be liquidated. It is necessary for the victory of communism. The last argument by these red liberals is a utilitarian one, which if were true to begin with would be utilitarian cowardice and reformism. The claim is that the proposed alternative, the Nordic model, creates far worse conditions for sex workers than if it were to be legalized. For this argument, they always bring up specific examples from Sweden or Norway. However, these advocates for legalization never look to Germany, which has had legal prostitution for over a century, and currently has a thriving brothel industry. The case of legal prostitution in Germany is rarely talked about, especially for legalization advocates, and for good reason. Luckily, the organization Fight the New Drug, which is a anti-porn group, has a useful report detailing the situation regarding prostitution in Germany. In 2002, when Germany's Prostitution Act came into effect, which formalized prostitution as a regular job, it had very little effect on eliminating the underground market. According to the report, in addition to legalizing pimping, when the Prostitution Act came into effect in 2002, it made it possible for prostituted people to become regular employees, subject to taxation, and access to social benefits. Yet only 44 out of an estimated 400,000 to 1 million prostituted people have chosen to register as prostitutes in order to access said benefits. Interestingly, the legalized sex work industry is one in which capitalists and the criminal element intermix, as there is heavy involvement by biker gangs. The article also highlights some of the criminal acts conducted by brothels, specifically flat-rate brothels. According to the report, flat-rate brothels offer all-inclusive deals similar to all-you-can-eat buffets. In some cases, snacks and drinks are included in the deal. A flat-rate brothel chain makes headlines when, on its opening day in 2009, 1,700 men lined up to get in. The long lineups outside women's rooms lasted until closing time, when many of the women collapsed from exhaustion, pain, injuries, and infections. Not only are situations like this very common, but the sex workers themselves are typically from Eastern Europe and are victims of human trafficking. While the state tries to crack down on it, the practice is too prevalent for anything to be done, as the lines are quite blurry. In conclusion, all pro-sex work advocates are liberals masquerading as socialists. These people are to be singled out, ridiculed, and labeled as class enemies. I wanted to end this video on a personal message to my audience because of the suspected problems which I believe plague younger men and women like us. Most of you, I am sure, are 18 to 25-year-old men. Many, if not most, are virgins and feel socially alienated and likely plagued with porn addiction. While under capitalism there is not much we can do about the present situation, you can at least unburden yourselves from the social ills of porn addiction and the doomer mentality. Which is why I recommend the internet forum nofap.com, which will provide advice and support for quitting porn as well as general self-improvement help. The forum is premised on a science-based, secular, and sex-positive opposition to porn, so it's not some Bible thumper shit. The best thing for us to do right now is to mentally and physically prepare ourselves for a revolutionary situation. This means that you should stop watching porn, lift weights or any other form of exercise, practice proper diet and health, and practice and apply your social skills in order to promote revolutionary ideas. Not only is this important for revolutionary efforts, but will generally improve your own life as well by living with purpose and direction. Porn, prostitution, and hookups are also no replacement for an actual sex life. Passionless satisfaction of self-serving desires is not comparable to sex fueled by love and passion.
Do you have the resources to give to somebody so that they don't have to rely on this trade? If you don't, you cannot just go and dictate to them about how their life is stupid, and yes, you do come across as swervy. And it's easy to see these dogmas in full force when you see people point to the swervish views of Lenin, Karl, or Engels as how is that in any way helpful?
Swerf gang, rise up.
about my own way.